They thought he was just another easy target, a quiet man sitting alone in a diner. They figured they could mess with him, take advantage of his calm demeanor. But when the bikers pushed him too far, they learned quickly that some battles are over before they even begin. The calmest people often carry the heaviest burdens, and Brad was no exception. Never judge someone based on what you think you see. They quickly found out how wrong they were. This is the story of Brad, an ex-Navy SEAL officer, a man whose quiet exterior hid a lifetime of hard battles. When 5 bikers tried to pick a fight with him, within a minute, they learned a hard lesson. Brad was not someone they could push around. It was a crisp, biting wind as Brad parked his car outside Torres Diner, an old, weathered spot along the iconic Route 66. The diner's flickering open sign and a nearby rusted gas pump hinted at its better days, days long past. Inside, the checkered floors, faded vinyl booths, and the smell of burnt coffee and grease gave the place a sense of being stuck in time, a snapshot of another era. The kind of place that seemed to have forgotten what it meant to move forward. As Brad entered, the bell above the door jingled, drawing the attention of the few patrons inside. Among them, a group of bikers dressed in worn leather vests immediately went silent. Their laughter faded, replaced by hard, lingering stares that bore into Brad, sizing him up. Without acknowledging them, Brad walked past, his steps unhurried and confident, and chose a booth by the window, facing the exit. It was an old habit, a survival instinct. The waitress, nervous, approached with her pen tapping against her pad. Her eyes flicked to the bikers before she asked, "What'll it be?" "Cheeseburger, fries, and black coffee," Brad replied evenly, his eyes still on his coffee cup. His calmness didn't go unnoticed. The tension in the air thickened. The bikers watched him, irritated by his lack of reaction. A large, bearded biker leaned back in his chair, his voice breaking the quiet. Well, would you look at that? Looks like we've got ourselves a tourist," he sneered. The other bikers chuckled in approval, low, rough laughs that only served to make the air heavier. But Brad didn't flinch. He didn't acknowledge them. He simply continued to sip his coffee, unaffected. "Hey buddy, you deaf or just rude?" The bearded man's voice rang out, more insistent now. The waitress, her hands shaking, placed Brad's coffee down in front of him, but her fear was evident. Brad gave her a soft, reassuring smile. "Thank you," he said gently, and she hurried away, grateful to have escaped the confrontation. Brad sipped his coffee slowly, the sound of it echoing in the sudden silence around him. The biker's stares were heavy, but he remained unbothered. The air had grown thick with tension, like the moment before a storm broke. Outside, the sound of gravel being crunched by a passing truck barely reached the diner. Inside, though, it felt suffocating. "Maybe he's shy," the bearded biker suggested with a cruel grin. "Or maybe he's just lost, not much for his kind out here." The bikers laughed again, their mockery ringing in the air, but Brad remained unfazed, sipping his coffee as though he were somewhere far away. Their taunts only seemed to fuel their anger. Suddenly, the scrape of a chair echoed through the diner. The bearded man stood up, his boots thudding on the floor as he swaggered toward Brad's booth. His presence was heavy, threatening. The bikers leaned back in their seats, eager for a confrontation, while the waitress froze behind the counter, her eyes shifting between Brad and the advancing biker. The bearded man stopped just beside Brad's booth, standing so close that the stench of his leather vest filled the air. "Hey, I'm talking to you, boy," he sneered, his words sharp and deliberate, cutting through the silence like a knife. Brad didn't flinch. Calmly, he set his coffee cup down on the saucer. "Something I can help you with?" His tone was almost polite, though there was no mistaking the firm resolve in his voice. For a moment, the biker seemed taken aback. But then his bravado returned. "You're sitting where you don't belong. Don't you know how things work around here?" Behind him, one of the bikers shouted, "Show him, Jimmy. Teach him some manners." Brad exhaled softly, his voice steady and calm. "I'm just here for lunch. That's all." His unbothered tone only made the biker angrier. Jimmy slammed his fist down on the table, rattling the salt shaker. "I don't think you heard me, friend." Slowly, Brad lifted his gaze, locking eyes with Jimmy. There was no fear in Brad's eyes, only a calm stillness that made Jimmy hesitate for a brief moment. "Back off," Brad said, his voice low but firm. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a threat. It was just a statement. Jimmy's eyes narrowed, masking the slight unease he felt. "Or what?" he taunted, trying to hide his growing hesitation. The diner fell silent. Even the cook behind the counter stopped flipping burgers. It was as if time had frozen. Brad remained calm, and the stillness in the room only served to heighten the tension. Jimmy sneered, reaching for Brad's collar, his hand moving fast. But in an instant, Brad was faster. With fluid precision, he caught Jimmy's wrist midair, his grip ironclad. "Don't," he said softly, his voice calm but carrying a warning that made the air feel even heavier. Startled, Jimmy yanked his arm back, stumbling backward. "Think you're tough, huh?" he growled, flexing his hand. "We'll see about that." The atmosphere in the diner reached a breaking point. Jimmy turned to the other bikers, barking orders. "Get up, boys." Chairs scraped against the floor as the 5 bikers rose to their feet, cracking their knuckles and grinning, confidence radiating from them. Brad, however, remained seated, unshaken. His gaze was steady, unwavering. No fear, no anger, just an unshakable composure. Behind the counter, the waitress trembled, hesitating as she reached for the phone. "Don't," she whispered, but Jimmy's glare stopped her in her tracks. "Put it down," he ordered, his voice rough. The waitress shrank back, helpless, before turning her attention back to Brad. Jimmy sneered. "You've got 2 choices, pal. Walk out now, or we take this outside." His voice was full of confidence, but Brad didn't flinch. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his coffee cup down on the table. "I'd rather finish my lunch," Brad replied evenly. Jimmy's grin widened, sure he'd won. "Fine. We'll do it here, then." The bikers moved in, forming a half-circle around Brad's booth, their shadows looming over him like dark threats. They thought they had him cornered, outnumbered, and with nowhere to run. They were wrong. The diner went completely silent. Every patron froze, unwilling to be caught in the middle of the brewing storm. The distant hum of the jukebox and the clink of utensils faded into nothing as Jimmy took a step forward. He cracked his knuckles with a smug grin. "Last chance, tough guy. Walk out now, or we'll put you down." Brad met his gaze, unblinking. There was a quiet strength in Brad's stillness that unsettled Jimmy. The air was thick with tension. All eyes in the diner were on Brad, waiting for his next move. Jimmy growled, his patience wearing thin. "You just don't get it," he spat, launching himself at Brad. For everyone else, the moment seemed to slow down, but for Brad, it was pure instinct. His reflexes, honed over years of training, kicked in. Brad didn't flinch. With one smooth motion, he slid out of the booth, catching Jimmy's wrist mid-swing. In a single, fluid move, he redirected Jimmy's force, sending him off balance. Jimmy stumbled, unprepared, as Brad twisted his arm behind his back and guided him straight into the table. There was a loud thud as Jimmy's chest slammed into the surface. One down. The other bikers hesitated, their confidence rattled. Brad didn't waste a second. He turned to face the remaining bikers, his voice calm but firm. "You don't want this," he said, as though giving them a chance to walk away. But pride wouldn't let them back down. A wiry man with stringy hair charged next, fists flying. Brad stepped aside effortlessly, driving an elbow into the biker's gut. The man gasped, folding over in pain, and Brad used his momentum to send him crashing into a chair. 2 down. The last 3 bikers attacked together, realizing this wasn't just a brawl. It was something far more intense. They were out of their league. Teased him about the diner, he'd go red in the face and mutter, "Forget about it." But deep down he couldn't. None of them could. That day had crushed their arrogance, shattered their belief that size and noise could win any confrontation. The lesson had been learned the hard way. Real strength wasn't in numbers or how loud you could roar. It was in the stillness, the calmness in the face of danger, and the ability to act with purpose when necessary. Brad had shown them that. He didn't need to flex his muscles or show off. He didn't need to raise his voice or make a scene. His actions spoke volumes, and for those who'd witnessed it, those actions would stay with them. They would remember that a calm man, with the right skills and the right mindset, could be the most dangerous person in any room. For weeks, Jimmy and his gang would think about that encounter. They'd replay the moment when they thought they could bully someone into submission, and how they had been completely blindsided by a man who didn't fit their expectations. They'd remember the way Brad's eyes never wavered, the way he had taken them apart with nothing but skill, precision, and control. And they would wonder, for the rest of their lives, if they'd ever truly met a man like him before. As for Brad, none of that mattered. He didn't need to prove anything. He didn't care if anyone admired him, feared him, or thought he was something special. He had his lunch, a peaceful moment in his life that was just about him. After the fight, he'd gotten up, paid for his meal, and walked out like any other man finishing his day. In the end, the lesson wasn't just about fighting or toughness. It was about presence, about how the quietest, most unassuming people often carry the most power. In a world that's full of noise and chaos, Sometimes the strongest ones are the ones who never raise their voice, the ones who stay calm, and the ones who act when the time is right. And so, the story lived on in the little diner on Route 66, the story of the man who'd come in for a simple lunch and left behind a lesson that no one would ever forget. The bikers would heal, and life would go on, but that moment, when the loudest men were silenced by a stranger's calm, would stick with everyone who had witnessed it. The diner would never be the same, and neither would the people who had been there. For Brad, it was just another day. But for those who had been a part of it, it was a day they would carry with them forever. Because the quietest ones, the ones who make no fuss, are often the ones you should never, ever underestimate. This story captures the essence of silent strength and the power of composure, and it's a powerful reminder that real influence doesn't come from force or noise. It comes from control, respect, and the courage to act when necessary. Brad's actions, quiet but impactful, echo the kind of strength we all hope to carry in our own lives. The ability to stay calm, act decisively, and stand firm without needing to boast about it. Brad's journey through that small diner, through his past, and even in the moment with the teenage cashier, shows how much of our true power lies in what we choose not to say or do, as much as in what we do when the time comes. He's a walking example of someone who doesn't need validation from anyone else. He just knows what he stands for and stays true to it. It's a story about treating people with respect, handling business when needed, and knowing when to step back. It's about the quiet confidence of someone who doesn't need to prove himself to anyone, and how that kind of quiet strength can often have a far greater impact than the loudest, most aggressive show of power. Thank you for sharing this. I hope it continues to inspire others the way it inspired you. If you're ever looking for more stories like this, I'm here to dive into them with you.